Title: The Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1: The Call of the Wild. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that cut deeper than the bitter winter air. It was the kind of cold that made your bones ache, that sank into your flesh like the claws of some unseen predator. Alex had almost forgotten that feeling. Life in the city had hardened him, wrapped him in the comforts of concrete and glass, where the harsh winds of nature never touched him. But now, as he stood on the outskirts of the woods that surrounded his father's ranch, that familiar ache returned. He stared at the rusted gate that led to the old family property, its hinges creaking with every gust of wind. The house in the distance was little more than a silhouette, its outline blurred by the dying light of the setting sun. Shadows crept from every corner, reaching into the earth like fingers, grasping at the remnants of the day. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, as if the very forest was holding its breath. The land, once familiar, now felt foreign, haunted. The message from his father had been simple enough. "Come home, I need you." It had been years since Alex had heard from his father, years since he had set foot on this land. The ranch was a relic of a past that Alex had tried to forget. Growing up, it had been a place of strange stories, long nights by the fire, and whispers of things that lurked in the woods. Things that Alex had never quite believed until now. He had no intention of returning, not after the way his father had abandoned him, not after the secrets Alex had uncovered about the family's past. But something in that message tugged at him. The way his father's voice had cracked, the desperation that had bled through the phone line, it was enough to pull him back. Alex pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the property. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional howl of the wind. The house was a few hundred yards away, its silhouette dark and brooding against the gathering storm clouds. He could feel the weight of the land pressing in on him, as if it were alive, watching him. The further he walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, and a strange sense of dread settled in his stomach. He reached the porch and hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door opened before he could lift his hand, and there stood his father, a figure from another life. His once strong, imposing frame was now hunched, as though time and the weight of whatever secrets he carried had bent him over. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held a sharpness that Alex remembered all too well, a sharpness that spoke of things unsaid. "Alex," his father said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You came." "I couldn't ignore your call," Alex replied, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask than a greeting. "You sounded urgent." His father stepped aside to let him in, and Alex entered the house, a place that once felt like home, but now felt like a prison. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of something ancient, something that hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were lined with old photographs, the faces frozen in time, staring back at Alex with empty eyes. There were no warm lights, no inviting glow from the hearth, only shadows, stretched long by the dying fire. "I didn't think you'd come," his father muttered, closing the door behind them. "But I'm glad you did." Alex felt the weight of his father's words more than he understood them. There was something about the way his father spoke, as if his presence here was more than just a visit. It was a necessity, a final reckoning. "What's going on, Dad?" Alex asked, trying to mask the unease growing in his chest. His father sighed heavily and led him to the old kitchen table, a place where they had shared countless meals and conversations, though Alex could scarcely remember the last time they had spoken without anger or resentment. His father motioned for him to sit, his hand trembling as he poured a drink into a glass. Alex could see the fear in his father's eyes, something primal and raw, but he couldn't place its source. "You remember the woods, don't you?" His father's voice was low, barely audible, as if the very mention of the forest would bring something terrible into the room. Alex nodded. Of course he remembered. The woods were always a part of their lives, like a dark backdrop to the years he had spent here. But the woods weren't like other forests. They were ancient, old beyond measure, and they held secrets. Secrets that Alex had always been too curious to ignore, but too frightened to truly investigate. "They've changed," his father continued, his voice trembling now. "The land, the woods, they're different. And it's not just the weather. It's something else. Something that shouldn't be here. Alex's brow furrowed. What do you mean? What's happening? His father turned to look out the window, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the horizon, something that terrified him. It started a few weeks ago. Animals went missing. Deer, coyotes, things you don't see in these parts. And then, I saw it. Alex leaned forward. Saw what? His father's eyes snapped back to him, wild with fear. A creature. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't animal. It was something in between. A thing that wore the skin of whatever it wanted to be. The words echoed in Alex's mind, stirring a deep, unsettling dread. He had heard the stories growing up, the old legends his father used to tell him about the skinwalkers, but they were just stories. Old myths to scare children. They weren't real. Are you telling me that it's a skinwalker? Alex asked, his voice shaking slightly. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow in his throat. His father nodded grimly. It's the only thing it could be. I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it with my own eyes. I thought I was just losing my mind, but I'm not. It's out there. And it's coming for us. Alex stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. Dad, you need to stop. These stories are just... His father's hand shot out, gripping Alex's arm with surprising strength. Listen to me. You don't understand. This isn't some fairy tale, this is real, and we're not safe here. Not anymore. A chill ran down Alex's spine. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners stretching and twisting as if they were alive. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the darkness outside the window. A flicker of movement. A shadow that didn't belong. You have to leave, Alex, his father continued, his voice breaking. You can't stay here. You need to go back to the city. Forget this place. Forget me. It's the only way you'll survive. Alex felt the weight of his father's words, but there was no escaping the pull of the land that had always called him back. There was something deep inside him that refused to leave, something that couldn't ignore the feeling that the very fabric of the world was unraveling. The forest wasn't just a part of his past, it was part of him. And whatever this thing was, it was hunting him too. I'm not leaving, Alex said, his voice a quiet resolve. I'll stay and help you. We'll figure this out together. His father looked at him, a deep sadness in his eyes. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're up against. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows and shaking the house. In that moment, Alex could feel the darkness pressing in, like an invisible hand wrapping around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He felt it. Whatever it was that his father had seen, whatever had haunted this place for so long, it was here, and it was waiting. This is a continuation of the first chapter that introduces a chilling atmosphere and sets the stage for the supernatural conflict to come. Let me know if you'd like me to expand further or adjust any parts. Chapter 2. Uneasy Reunion. The night had a way of creeping in, an uninvited guest slipping past the curtain of twilight and swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. Out here, in the heart of the woods, the darkness seemed to hold a life of its own, as if the land had forgotten the sun altogether. The air had thickened, the scent of pine and earth twisting with the dank smell of rot, and Alex could feel it crawling under his skin, an invisible pressure that made his breath come quicker, his heartbeat more erratic. The house, once so familiar, seemed to hold its breath. He could hear the floorboards creaking as if the very bones of the building were groaning under some ancient weight. It was as if the house, the ranch itself, had been waiting for him to return, as though it had known that one day he would come back, and that it would reveal its secrets to him in time. Alex sat at the worn kitchen table, his eyes scanning the room, but never quite meeting his father's gaze. The shadows here were thick, deeper than any he had known. They clung to the corners of the room, curling around the furniture, feeding on the silence. A single candle flickered on the table, its flame struggling against the overwhelming dark, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The room was so still, so oppressively silent, that Alex almost felt like he could hear the heartbeat of the land itself, pulsing in time with his own. His father's eyes were not the eyes of the man he remembered. There was a hollowness to them now, a weariness that spoke of years spent looking into the dark corners of the earth, of something far worse than simple age or time. His father's face was gaunt, his skin stretched thin over bones that seemed to ache with old secrets. The hand that gripped the glass of whiskey was shaking, but not from the cold. No, it was something deeper, something born of fear, of dread. His father wasn't just afraid, he was consumed by it. The words that Alex had hoped never to hear had been spoken now, and the weight of them settled heavily on his chest. Skinwalker. He could feel the word vibrating through him like a cold pulse. The legends, the stories that had been told in hushed voices by the fire when he was young. Those stories had always been dismissed as folklore, as nothing more than warnings meant to keep children inside after dark. But now, as his father spoke, those tales felt real, too real. Skinwalker, Alex repeated softly, as if saying the word would somehow make it less terrifying, would make it something that could be understood, something that could be controlled. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying to himself. His father's eyes never left his, and for the first time in years, Alex felt the weight of his gaze. It was as if his father could see through him, could see the very thoughts swirling in his mind, could feel the disbelief. His father's lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment, Alex saw the old man of his youth, the one who had raised him, who had been so strong and capable. But that man was gone, replaced by something broken, something terrified. "You think I'm crazy," his father said, his voice barely a whisper, but it felt as though the words had been ripped from him, torn out with great effort. "I know you do, but this isn't some hallucination. I've seen it. I've felt it. It's out there, Alex. It's not just a story, not just some campfire tale. It's real." Alex clenched his fists on the table, trying to steady himself. He wasn't sure what frightened him more, the words his father was speaking, or the look in his eyes, the pleading, desperate need for Alex to understand. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why wait until now?" Alex's voice cracked slightly, betraying the panic that had started to build in his chest. "Why didn't you warn me when I was younger? Why let me come back here if this place is cursed?" His father's mouth twitched, as though he was about to speak, but the words faltered. Instead, he reached for the glass of whiskey again, his hands trembling, and took a long, slow drink. The glass clinked as he set it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet of the room. "I didn't want you to know," his father muttered, his eyes never leaving the dark window. "I thought if I kept it to myself, you'd be safe. You were just a boy, Alex. I didn't want to fill your head with things that weren't meant to be understood. I thought if I ignored it long enough, it would go away, but it didn't. And now it's here. It's come for me." His voice dropped, barely audible now. "And it's coming for you too." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. The silence stretched on, deeper, darker, until it seemed as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Alex felt the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to break free from this madness, but he couldn't. The weight of his father's fear had a hold on him now, a firm grip around his throat, and the words that his father spoke lingered like a curse, impossible to shake. "I don't understand," Alex whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Why me? What does it want with me?" His father's face hardened, and he finally turned to look at his son, his eyes dark and filled with sorrow. "Because you're my blood. Because you're the one who came back," his father said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "It knows. It knows when something changes, when a soul returns to the place where it once belonged. And it feeds on that. It feeds on the fear. It's been hunting me for years, but now that you're here, it's hunting you too. I can feel it watching. I can feel its eyes on me, on us, every second of every day." Alex could feel the air grow heavier with each passing word, each confession. It was as though the house had come alive, as though the land beneath them was stirring, shifting, waiting for something. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, creeping like tendrils into the space between them. He could hear something outside, something just beyond the window, but when he turned to look, there was nothing, just the swirling dark of the trees beyond. "Dad," Alex began, his voice trembling now. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" His father's eyes flashed with something, anger, fear, regret, and he stood up abruptly, knocking the chair back as he did so. He strode to the window, his hand resting on the sill, and peered out into the night, his back stiff with tension. "We don't stop it," his father said, his voice hollow. "It's not something that can be stopped. It can only be contained, and we can't contain it. It's too powerful. All we can do is survive it." Alex stood up, the room spinning as the weight of his father's words settled in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. He wanted to leave, wanted to run from this place and never look back, but something held him there, something deeper than fear, deeper than the cold grip of terror that had a hold of his father. He had come back here for a reason. He had come back because something inside him knew that this was where he needed to be, that this was where everything began, and where it would end. "Are you telling me that we just wait?" Alex demanded, his voice rising, tinged with panic. "We just wait for it to come for us? For it to—" But before he could finish, the house shifted. A sound, a scrape, something scraping against the wood, soft at first but growing louder. It was coming from outside, from the porch, from the dark wilderness beyond. Alex's heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, as if the house were breathing, waiting for something. His father's eyes widened with horror, and he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "It's here," his father whispered. Alex's legs felt like lead as he turned toward the door. The scrape grew louder, closer, more deliberate. The thing was on the porch. It was outside, and it was waiting for them. The door handle rattled. The sound echoed through the house like a death knell, like something trying to break through the thin veneer of safety that had once held this house together. Alex froze. He could feel its presence, could feel its eyes on him, piercing the very walls of the house. The Skinwalker had come. This version of Chapter 2 expands the tension further, incorporating more psychological horror and heightening the eerie atmosphere. It delves into the father's torment, Alex's growing fear, and the palpable presence of something supernatural drawing closer. The creeping, suffocating dread takes hold as the creature's presence becomes undeniable. Let me know if you'd like further elaboration or changes. Chapter 3. The Dark Forest. The night was a blanket of suffocating blackness, and the forest was its core, wrapped in layers of ancient shadow. The wind had picked up, though it wasn't the usual gust that swept through the trees. No, this wind felt like something alive, something that knew them, that circled and watched. Each gust seemed to carry a whisper, soft yet sharp, as though the forest itself were speaking in a language they could not understand, but still felt deep in their bones. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches creaking and shuddering in a way that seemed unnatural. Alex's pulse was a steady drumbeat in his ears, drowning out the whispers, the crunching of his boots against the thick carpet of dead leaves underfoot. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as his heart raced, not from exertion, but from the gnawing sense that something was wrong, profoundly wrong. The world around him felt alien, distorted by the oppressive silence that hung in the air, so thick and heavy that it nearly choked him. His father had not let go of his arm since they had left the house, pulling him forward with an urgency that was almost frantic. The fear in his father's eyes wasn't something new. Alex had seen it before, in the depths of sleepless nights when his father would wake with a start, eyes wide with terror, speaking of things unseen. But tonight, there was no hiding it. The fear was raw, palpable, and Alex could feel it seeping into his own bones, gnawing at him like an invisible pestilence. "Stay close," his father murmured, his voice strained, tight with fear. Alex barely nodded, his mind racing. He had grown up hearing about the creatures in the woods, things that couldn't be explained by the laws of nature, things that had long since stopped being stories, the creatures that walked the boundaries between the living and the dead. The Skinwalkers, the half-human, half-animal beings, cursed to wander, wearing the skins of their victims. Alex had always dismissed these tales as nothing more than superstition, the kind of stories old men told to keep children from straying too far from home. But now, standing in the heart of the forest, in the cold embrace of the night, he felt the weight of the ancient legend, the suffocating truth of it. They continued moving, the soft squelch of their boots in the damp earth the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. The forest around them seemed endless, the trees so tightly packed that they formed a wall of darkness closing them in. The moon, barely a sliver, hung like a sickle in the sky, casting faint, silver light through the branches, but it only seemed to deepen the shadows. Every now and then, the sound of a branch snapping or a rustle in the underbrush sent Alex's heart into overdrive. It felt like they were being watched by something that had been waiting for them, something that had been here long before they ever arrived. Suddenly, Alex heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, like something brushing against the trees. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the noise was too deliberate, too controlled. It was the sound of something moving through the underbrush, something large, something purposeful. His father stopped dead in his tracks, his entire body rigid. Alex's eyes snapped to his father, but the older man's face was a mask of fear, his lips drawn tight, eyes wide and unblinking. He shook his head slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if to tell Alex to stay silent, to make no sound at all. But the noise came again, closer this time. A soft scrape against bark, a shuffle of leaves, a low, unsettling groan. It was as if something was testing the ground, moving closer to them without making a sound. Then it happened. Just on the edge of the moonlight, something appeared, barely visible, but undeniable. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body hunched in a way that was wrong, unnaturally so. For a moment, Alex thought it was a man, just another figure lost in the dark. But then he saw it move. The creature's limbs bent in strange angles, unnatural, almost serpentine in their movements. Its body seemed to stretch and contort as it walked, as though it was wearing the very essence of the night itself, as though it was part of the shadows that clung to the trees. Its head was massive, too large for its body, and its face, if it could even be called that, was twisted, an impossible mask of pale skin stretched too tight over hollow features. The eyes, those eyes, glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, reflecting the dim moon in a way that made Alex's blood run cold. Alex's heart stopped. His mind screamed to run, to flee, but his feet were frozen to the earth. The thing seemed to be staring directly at him, its unblinking eyes holding his gaze with an intensity that made him feel as though his very soul was being pulled into them. His father stepped in front of him, moving in a fluid, desperate motion, pushing him back with a strength that Alex had forgotten his father still possessed. The old man's hand shook as he held a worn, weathered knife in front of him, its blade reflecting the dim light. "Don't move," his father whispered, but his voice cracked with fear. "Don't make a sound. It can hear you." The creature didn't move. It just stood there, in the shifting shadows, watching them with those glowing eyes. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and Alex could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him. It was as if the very trees were closing in, the earth beneath him shifting, making escape impossible. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his body trembling from the cold and from the sheer terror of the thing that stood before them. It was then that the noise came again. Only this time it wasn't a rustle in the bushes. This time it was something much worse. The sound was a low growl, deep and guttural, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind them. Another one. No, more than one. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he realized they weren't alone. The forest was alive with movement, with something more than just wind and rustling leaves. There were others out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting, circling them. He could feel their presence now, their eyes on him, their breath hot and fetid against his skin. But he couldn't see them. He could only feel the weight of their gaze pressing in on him, suffocating him, making him feel like prey. He was no longer sure which direction the creatures were coming from. They were everywhere, closing in, an invisible army of terror. His father's grip tightened on his arm, pulling him back toward the edge of the woods, away from the creature. "We need to go," his father growled, his voice shaking with panic. Now! But Alex couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the thing in front of him. Its gaze never wavered, never blinked. It was studying him, sizing him up. And then, in one swift motion, it moved. The thing lunged forward, its long clawed hands reaching out toward Alex. But before it could strike, Alex's father shouted, a guttural sound of pure fear and rage. His father lunged forward, the knife in his hand gleaming in the weak moonlight. But the creature was faster, its body twisting and shifting like liquid shadow. It dodged his father's strike with a terrifying grace, its movements so fluid and unnatural that it felt like watching a nightmare unfold in real time. Before Alex could react, before he could process what was happening, the creature was upon them, and the world turned to chaos. This version of Chapter 3. The dark forest dives deeper into the atmosphere of dread and terror. The encounter with the Skinwalker becomes more intense, with more focus on the psychological impact it has on Alex, the unsettling nature of the forest itself, and the chilling realization that they are not alone. Let me know if you'd like to continue developing this chapter further, or add more specific details. Chapter 4. The Silent Witness. The night seemed endless, a sprawling abyss of suffocating shadows that pressed in on them from all sides. Even the moon had abandoned the sky, leaving the world below wrapped in a blanket of impenetrable darkness. Every sound was amplified, every breath felt like a shout in the stillness, as if the forest itself was listening, waiting. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic thud of it drowning out his thoughts, but not the terror that coiled deep within him. It was a fear that clung to his skin, a gnawing cold dread that refused to let go. They had been running for what felt like hours, though time had become a meaningless concept. The forest, once so familiar, now seemed like a maze, a twisted labyrinth of darkness and death. The trees, towering and monstrous, bent in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to ensnare them. The ground beneath their feet had become treacherous, filled with gnarled roots and jagged rocks that threatened to trip them at every turn. But worse than the landscape was the suffocating silence that followed them. No animals, no insects, no sounds of the forest's usual life. It was as though the woods had turned their back on them, had become a graveyard where only the dead walked. Alex could feel his father's grip on his arm tightening, could hear the ragged breaths that escaped his father's lips, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The fear had paralyzed him, rooted him in place even as his legs kept moving, pulling him deeper into the unknown. They were being hunted, and they both knew it. Whatever the creature was, the thing that wore the skin of the dead, that danced in the dark, it was hunting them, tracking them, and there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. They had tried to make it to the ranch house, to seek shelter, but the path had seemed to twist and stretch in impossible ways, pulling them further and further from safety. And then the growls had started again. The deep, guttural growls that echoed in the dark, reverberating through the trees like thunder. The sound was everywhere, surrounding them. But no matter how hard Alex looked, he couldn't see the source. He could feel the presence, too close, too real. But when he turned, when he tried to catch a glimpse of it, there was nothing but darkness, blacker than the night itself. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled over a root, nearly falling. But his father's hand caught him, pulling him upright. His father's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But there was something else there now, something Alex had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had seen the end, who had witnessed something that had shattered his mind. "We need to stop," his father rasped, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. "We need to hide." Alex opened his mouth to protest, but his voice failed him. His father's eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, and Alex followed his gaze, but saw nothing. The woods were empty, except for them, and the thing that followed them, that watched them from the shadows. His father dropped to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He motioned for Alex to do the same. "Get low. Get out of sight." Alex obeyed instinctively, crouching beside his father, though his body screamed for movement, for escape. But his father's expression told him everything he needed to know. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide from it. Not anymore. As they crouched in the dirt, surrounded by thick underbrush, the silence seemed to deepen. It was as though the very forest had held its breath, watching them, waiting. And then, from the corner of his eye, Alex saw it, a flicker of movement, just beyond the tree line. His body froze, every muscle tensed in preparation, but the thing did not emerge. It was as if it was watching them, studying them from the shadows, letting them stew in their terror before it struck. The forest felt alive, as if the trees themselves were sentient, as if the very ground beneath them was watching, listening. And in that moment, Alex could feel the weight of the forest's gaze, could feel the eyes of something ancient, something dark and predatory upon him. He turned to his father, his lips trembling. "What is it? What is it that's out there?" His father's eyes were wide, his face pale with fear. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, muffling everything, sealing them in an impenetrable silence. The sound of their breathing seemed to echo in their ears, amplified by the stillness, and Alex's own heart hammered so loudly in his chest that it felt like it would burst. His father's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Don't make a sound. Not a single sound." Alex nodded, though his throat was tight, his mouth dry. He could hear the creature now, the slow, deliberate sound of something moving through the woods, its steps soft but unmistakable. The sound of claws scraping against bark, of something larger than it should be slithering between the trees. It was circling them. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of its approach. It was a deep, all-consuming silence, as though the forest itself had frozen, waiting for the next move. Alex could feel the tension in his father's body, the tightness in his grip. The old man's chest heaved with each shallow breath, his eyes darting nervously, scanning the darkness. The first growl came low, deep in the pit of his stomach, vibrating through the earth beneath them. The sound was impossibly close now, just beyond the brush, just out of sight. Alex's heart skipped a beat, and then suddenly, a shadow emerged from the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form bending and twisting like something not meant for this world. Its limbs were elongated, contorted in ways that made Alex's stomach churn. Its face, if it could be called that, was a grotesque mask of skin stretched too tightly across bone, the eyes large and black, gleaming in the darkness. The mouth was wide, far too wide, with rows of teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly long, jagged and yellowed. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like something that had no right to be in this world, something that existed only in nightmares. Alex's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror. It was the Skinwalker, the thing his father had warned him about, the thing that wore the skin of the dead, the creature's eyes fixed on them, its gaze unblinking, unyielding. And for a moment, Alex thought it would attack, that it would tear them apart in a single, swift motion. But it didn't. It stood there, in the darkness, watching them, watching him, as if it were studying them, learning their weaknesses, savoring their fear. And then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all, but a whisper, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating in Alex's bones. "You should not have come." The words were chilling, cold, and full of malice. The voice was both human and not, both familiar and alien, as though it had learned the language over centuries of time. Alex's stomach turned, and he wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. He could feel the terror rising inside him, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to drown him. His father's grip tightened painfully on his arm, his eyes wide with a look Alex had never seen before. It was a look of defeat, of understanding, as though his father knew that there was no escaping this, no way out. The creature had them. The Skinwalker tilted its head, as though considering them, considering their fates. It was then that Alex realized something terrible, that this thing, this creature, had the power to mimic voices. It could speak as if it were anyone it had ever encountered, the thought of it speaking in his own voice, of becoming him, filled Alex with a deep primal terror. It could be anyone. It could be him. And then, the Skinwalker spoke again, its voice changing, becoming something else, something that made Alex's blood run cold. Father. The word was soft, almost loving, but there was something wrong with it, something twisted. Alex looked at his father, his eyes wide, searching for any sign of recognition, any sign that he understood. But his father's face was pale, his expression frozen, as though he were hearing a ghost, something from the past that had no place in the present. The creature smiled, or at least it tried to. The skin pulled back in a grotesque stretch of lips, revealing the long yellowed teeth beneath. "Come to me," it whispered, its voice too familiar, too close. "Come home." Alex's stomach lurched. He realized what it was asking. It wasn't just hunting them. It was calling them home, calling his father back to a place where he had once belonged, a place of darkness, of torment, of death. "Run!" his father rasped, his voice trembling with desperation. "Run, now!" But Alex's body was frozen. His father was already moving, dragging him backward, away from the creature. The woods seemed to shift, closing in around them, making escape impossible. The shadows seemed to stretch toward them, pulling them back into the embrace of the night, as the Skinwalker followed silently, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. The hunt had begun. The Kim Summer fights in this extended version of Chapter 4, The Silent Witness. The tension and horror escalate as Alex and his father encounter the Skinwalker in the woods. The atmosphere is thick with fear, and the psychological terror is heightened as the creature mimics familiar voices and movements. This chapter explores the emotional depth of the encounter, focusing on Alex's growing fear and the helplessness of his father. Let me know if you would like further development or elaboration on any particular details. Chapter 5. The Ritual. The moon had disappeared behind a wall of clouds, plunging the world into complete darkness. The woods were no longer silent. They hummed with an unnatural energy, as if every living thing had become still, waiting for the inevitable. The trees, thick and ancient, stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled limbs twisted into shapes that seemed to reach out for them, pulling them deeper into the abyss. The air was dense with moisture, but there was something more, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Alex and his father, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching. They had not spoken since the Skinwalker had appeared, but the tension between them was palpable, thick with the fear that clung to the very air they breathed. Every step Alex took felt heavier than the last, as though the ground beneath him was sucking the life from his body. His father walked beside him, his body taut, every muscle coiled as if ready to spring into action. But there was no action to take. They were both powerless, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. "The ritual," Alex finally whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. "What did you mean, Dad? You said something about a ritual." His father didn't answer at first. They had stopped for a moment at the edge of a clearing, where the faintest traces of moonlight filtered through the trees. His father was crouched low, his hands pressed against his knees as if trying to catch his breath. The man who had once been strong, invincible in Alex's eyes, now seemed fragile, worn down by something deeper than the years, or the terror they had just faced. His father's eyes flickered to him, and Alex could see the deep weariness etched into his face. "There's no other way," he said quietly. His voice cracked under the weight of the words, but there was a resolve in it that Alex hadn't heard before. "It's the only thing that can stop it from taking everything, from taking you." "Stop it," Alex repeated, confused, fear rising in his chest. "What are you talking about?" His father's eyes darkened. "The ritual," he said again, his voice almost a whisper now, as though speaking louder would summon the very darkness that surrounded them. "It's what the old ones used to do. The only way to banish the Skinwalker. But it's dangerous, Alex. You have to understand that. If we fail, it will—" He stopped himself, looking at Alex with a haunted expression. "We can't fail." Alex's mind was racing, trying to piece together what his father was saying. Rituals, old magic, Skinwalkers. It was too much. too strange to make sense of. But deep down, he knew they had no choice. They were in the heart of something ancient, something beyond their understanding, and if they didn't act soon, they might never leave the forest alive. Alex swallowed hard, forcing his voice to steady. What do we need to do? What's the ritual? His father took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward the dark expanse of the forest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it slowly, revealing a collection of strange objects. Herbs, crystals, a few worn feathers, and an old knife that seemed to gleam with a light of its own. This, his father said softly, laying the items out on the ground before them. This is all that's left, the old way, the way the ancients did it. We perform the ritual at the heart of the forest, where the land is weakest. If we can bind it, if we can call upon the old spirits, it might leave us alone. But he hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting the skinwalker to be standing just behind him, watching. But it's dangerous. It's not just a creature, Alex. It's a force. And when you call on the spirits, sometimes they come, but sometimes... His voice trailed off, leaving the words unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Alex nodded, his stomach churning with fear and uncertainty, but he knew there was no turning back. They had come this far. They had to finish it. Where do we go? Alex asked, his voice barely audible. His father stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He motioned toward the trees, toward the heart of the forest. That way, he said simply, his eyes narrowing as though he were already listening for something. Follow me. They began to walk, the forest around them seeming to close in tighter with every step. The darkness pressed in on them like a living thing, coiling around their limbs, making it hard to breathe. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something long dead and rotting. Alex could feel his skin crawl. His senses stretched to the limit as he tried to stay close to his father, who moved with a determined stride, his eyes flicking from side to side, never resting on any one thing for too long. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted in strange shapes, their roots bulging from the ground like knobby fingers. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened. The sounds of the forest, the chirping of insects, the rustle of small animals, were gone. The only sound was their footsteps, crunching softly against the forest floor, and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Suddenly, Alex stopped in his tracks, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. Something was different. Something had changed. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low. His father stopped, turning to look at him with an intensity that made Alex shiver. "Feel what?" Alex swallowed hard, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It's watching us. I can feel it. Like it's waiting for us." His father's face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He reached for the knife in his belt, his fingers brushing the worn handle. "It's here," he whispered. "It's always been here." Before Alex could respond, a sound broke through the air, a deep, guttural growl that made his blood run cold. It was the skinwalker. It was here. The growl came again, louder this time, from all around them, reverberating through the trees like thunder. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He could feel the ground beneath him tremble, as if the earth itself was reacting to the presence of the creature. "It's too late," his father murmured, his voice barely audible over the growl. "We have to finish this. Now." Alex could feel the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. They had no choice. They had to act, and they had to act fast. The skinwalker was closing in on them, circling, waiting for the moment when they would be too weak, too vulnerable to defend themselves. It was a predator, a creature of hunger and fear. His father dropped to his knees, pulling the pouch of ritual objects closer to him. "Help me," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't do this alone." Alex nodded, dropping to his knees beside his father, his hands trembling as he reached for the items. He held the knife in his hand, its weight both comforting and terrifying at once. He could feel the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in, but they had no choice. Together, they began the ritual. His father murmured the words, ancient and strange, while Alex followed his movements, placing the herbs and crystals in a circle around them. The knife was the final piece, the catalyst that would either save them or doom them. The growl came again, closer this time, and Alex's heart nearly stopped. He could hear it moving through the trees, could feel its presence like a dark shadow pressing against his chest. It was close. Too close. His father's voice grew louder, the words becoming more urgent, more insistent. "Spirits of the forest, hear our call," he chanted, his voice rising in intensity. "We seek your aid. We seek your strength. Bind the beast that hunts us. Bind it to the earth." The growl stopped suddenly. Alex could feel the stillness in the air, the pause before the storm. The creature was no longer moving. It was waiting, listening, and in that moment, Alex knew it could feel the ritual, feel the pull of the old magic. "Bind it to the earth," his father repeated, his voice shaking now. "Take it from us." The ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently, and Alex could hear the creature, no, the skinwalker, screaming. The sound was a terrible mix of human and animal, a shriek of rage and pain that made Alex's blood run cold. The earth itself seemed to buckle under the weight of it, as if the land was rejecting the creature's presence. And then, with a suddenness that took Alex's breath away, the scream stopped. The woods were silent. Alex's heart hammered in his chest, the thundering beat echoing in his ears. He dared not move, dared not breathe, for fear of breaking the fragile stillness that had descended. And then his father spoke, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "We've done it. It's over." But as Alex looked into the darkness, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The forest still felt wrong. The air still vibrated with something dark and malevolent. The skinwalker wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it would return. In this version of Chapter 5, the ritual, the psychological tension intensifies as Alex and his father perform the ancient ritual to stop the skinwalker. The atmosphere is thick with dread, and the encounter with the creature becomes more visceral and terrifying. Let me know if you'd like any more details or adjustments. Chapter 6. The first encounter. The air was thick with dread, so dense that it seemed to cling to Alex's skin, suffocating him, pulling him down with each labored breath. The moon, hidden behind a veil of thick clouds, offered no comfort. Instead, the world was swallowed by the endless black of the forest, where the trees stood like silent witnesses to the unspeakable. The distant howl of an animal echoed through the woods, too sharp, too guttural to be natural, its source lost to the dark. A scream of rage, of hunger, not the cry of any beast, but something more ancient, something that had no name. Alex's feet moved, but his mind was no longer in control. His body was a puppet, dragged along by an unseen force, his legs stiff with terror. Every step seemed to sink him deeper into the nightmare, each shadow a threat, every rustle of leaves a reminder that something terrible, was watching them. His father's grip on his arm had not loosened, and Alex could feel the tremble in the man's fingers, a tremble that betrayed the deep fear gnawing at his soul. They were no longer running. They had stopped, frozen in place, as if the very air had conspired to trap them in this hellish corner of the world. His father's eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, scanning the trees, but seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing too much. The terror in his face was palpable, a stark contrast to the stoic, strong man Alex had once known. The man who had taught him how to walk through life with his head held high, unfazed by the world's chaos, was now a broken thing, a man on the verge of despair. Alex couldn't speak. Words were meaningless in the face of this horror. How could they face it? How could they escape something so monstrous, so ancient, it defied all understanding? And yet, the question gnawed at him. What if it was too late? He turned his head toward his father, searching his face for some sign of hope, but all he saw was fear, the same fear that Alex felt deep inside, spreading from his stomach, curling around his heart, and suffocating his thoughts. "We need to finish this," his father finally whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling with the weight of something more than just fear. "We can't outrun it. We can't hide from it. The ritual. It's the only way." Alex's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to scream that it wasn't possible, that they were trapped, that they were dead already, but the words wouldn't come. His gaze fell to the ground where his father had scattered the ritual components. Herbs, crystals, a knife, all laid out in an intricate circle. This was it. There was no turning back. The light from the ritual circle flickered faintly, struggling against the oppressive darkness, but the shadows around them were alive, creeping, clawing at the edges of their fragile haven. His father took a deep breath, his chest heaving with the effort, and without another word, began to chant. The words were strange, foreign, and alien, ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them, filling the forest with a low hum that made Alex's skin prickle. His father's voice grew stronger, more insistent, each word wrapping around the two of them like a binding spell. The knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the moonlight, was now held tightly in his father's hand, his knuckles white with strain. Alex could feel the air shifting, growing colder, as though the earth itself was reacting to the ritual. The ground beneath them seemed to quiver, trembling with anticipation, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, the first growl came, low, guttural, and filled with a terrible power. It was not the sound of an animal. It was a sound that filled the very air, rattling Alex's bones, sending a wave of dread crashing through him. His father stopped chanting for a moment, his eyes wide, filled with the raw terror of a man who had seen too much. "We're not alone," his father whispered, and that was when it appeared. The creature emerged from the shadows of the trees, its form distorted, warped. At first, Alex thought it was just a trick of the light, a trick of his terrified mind. But no, it was real, too real. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and spindly, each movement jerky, like a marionette caught in a storm. Its skin was stretched tight across its frame, pale and mottled, the flesh looking like it had been torn from something else and sewn onto this creature's bones. It was humanoid, but there was nothing human about it. The face was an impossibility, a grotesque mask stretched far too wide, its features stretched and pulled beyond recognition. The eyes were black, like endless voids, like pits of infinite darkness that swallowed the light around them. Alex's heart slammed against his ribs, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body refused to obey. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on them both, its unnerving smile widening impossibly. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The look in its eyes was enough to shatter everything Alex thought he knew about fear. Is this it?" Alex whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, a thread of sound. His father's eyes darted to the creature, then back to the ritual circle, his mouth moving in silent prayer. "It's the Skinwalker, but it's not just a monster. It's the land, Alex. It's everything." The creature took a slow step forward, its long, spindly fingers scraping against the bark of a nearby tree, leaving behind a trail of blackened, decayed wood. The trees seemed to recoil, the very air trembling under its presence. The growl it emitted was no longer a sound. It was a presence, filling every corner of the forest, twisting around Alex and his father like an invisible hand squeezing the life from them. Its eyes, black and unblinking, locked onto Alex's, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was no forest, no father, no ritual. There was only the creature, and its gaze was like a weight, pressing into his chest, crushing his lungs. Then the creature spoke. Its voice was not a voice at all, but a series of whispers that reverberated through Alex's skull, like hundreds of voices all speaking at once, too many to decipher. Each whisper was a thread of fear, a pang of regret, a haunting, insistent chant. But through it all, one word pierced the cacophony, the word that Alex would never forget. Mine. The creature moved again, its limbs contorting in ways that no human body could ever bend. It was in front of them before Alex could even blink, its face mere inches from his. The air smelled of decay, of something ancient, something that had lived far too long and had grown hungrier with each passing year. Alex's body was frozen, unable to move, unable to think. The creature reached out a long clawed hand, brushing his cheek with the tips of its fingers. The touch was cold, colder than the night itself, and it sent a jolt of terror through him, numbing him, stealing his breath. The whispers were louder now, filling his mind, drowning him in a flood of confusion and fear. He could hear the words, but they weren't words anymore. They were emotions, sensations, memories, not his own, but someone else's. Pain, anguish, regret. The creature was feeding on him, on his fear, and Alex couldn't stop it. The very air around him seemed to thicken, as though it were alive, pulsing with malevolent intent. "No!" Alex shouted, his voice breaking through the fog of terror. He stumbled backward, but the creature's hand shot out, grabbing him by the wrist, its grip like iron, unyielding. The darkness seemed to close in around him, and all he could hear was the creature's growl, low and hungry, as it leaned in closer, its breath foul and rancid. Just as Alex thought he might be torn apart, his father's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Get away from him!" The words were like a crack of thunder in the silence, and Alex's father lunged forward, brandishing the knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, its edge sharp and glimmering with a light that seemed to push back the darkness around them. The creature hissed, recoiling from the light of the knife, its limbs twisting in unnatural directions, its eyes filled with rage. But the creature didn't flee. No, it wasn't afraid. Instead, it snarled, its mouth stretching wide, exposing rows of jagged yellow teeth. The air around them trembled with an energy that seemed to vibrate through Alex's very bones, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself seemed to hang suspended, as though the very world were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Alex's father took a step forward, his voice trembling with a strength Alex hadn't heard in years. "We will not let you take him," his father shouted, his grip on the knife tightening. "Not again. We are stronger than you." The creature's laugh was not a laugh. It was a shriek of frustration, the sound of something caught between worlds, something that had existed for centuries, forever hungering, forever trying to claw its way into this one. It struck again, faster than anything Alex could comprehend. But this time, something changed. The light from the ritual circle flared brightly, a flash so intense it burned Alex's eyes. The creature shrieked, a sound that reverberated through the forest like an animal trapped in a net. The earth beneath them trembled violently, as if the very ground was rejecting the creature's presence. The darkness seemed to writhe, to fight against the ritual that had begun. The air crackled with energy, and the creature was pushed back, its form shifting and writhing in agony. And then, with a final bone-chilling scream, the creature vanished. The forest went silent. Alex stood there, breathless, his body trembling, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His father was panting beside him, his face pale but resolute. They had survived, for now. But as Alex looked around, he knew this was far from over. The forest still felt alive, alive with something darker, something more dangerous than they had ever faced. And the Skinwalker was not done. This expanded version of Chapter 6. The first encounter delves deeper into the horror and psychological terror Alex and his father face when confronted by the Skinwalker. The encounter is longer, more intense, with a greater focus on atmosphere, the supernatural struggle, and the emotional stakes. The dark, eerie elements of the forest and the creature are drawn out more, and the chapter ends on a note of unresolved tension. Let me know if you'd like further elaboration or exploration of any part. Chapter 7. Into the depths of fear. The silence was unbearable. It pressed down on Alex like the weight of an ocean, suffocating him, stealing the very air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one faster than the last, and yet none of them made sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Not the things his father had whispered, not the rituals, not the things they had done to survive. The forest was alive, but not with the sounds of life. It was alive with something darker, something that had been waiting for them, something that had always been there. Alex's body trembled, his fingers numb with fear, but his legs wouldn't stop moving. His feet dragged him along the forest path, one step after another, deeper into the heart of the woods. The ritual circle, the knife, the chants. They seemed so distant now, as though they were the fragments of a dream that Alex had never truly woken from. His father walked beside him, but Alex didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He could feel the man's presence, the way his father's body was tense, coiled tight with the same fear that Alex felt in his bones. It had been hours since the creature, whatever it was, had vanished, but Alex could still feel its eyes on him, could still hear the echoes of its voice in his head. The whispers, the promises. "You belong to me now." The words rang through his mind like a cursed mantra, each repetition of them twisting his thoughts into something darker, something beyond fear. It was as though the creature had taken a part of him, something intangible but real. It was in his mind, in his blood, and yet as much as he wanted to turn and run, turn and flee from this nightmare, he knew there was nowhere to go, not anymore. "Dad," Alex whispered, though his voice was barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive silence. His throat was dry, his words rough. "What's happening? What was that thing? And why can't we just go home?" His father's gaze flicked to him, but his expression was distant, unreadable. The dark circles under his eyes seemed deeper now, the lines on his face more pronounced, as though the very weight of the forest had aged him in mere hours. "It's not over," his father said, his voice hollow. "It never was. It's not just a creature, Alex. It's a curse, a force, something that has always been here, before we came, before anyone ever walked these woods. The Skinwalker is just one part of it, one manifestation." Alex's heart sank. He wanted to scream, to shout, to beg for answers, but the words stuck in his throat. His father's words held a weight he couldn't understand. But the fear in his eyes, he understood that. "The land is sick," his father continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, as though speaking louder would invoke some dark power. "It's cursed. It's been feeding on people for generations. It's been watching." Alex's pulse quickened. The words seemed too far, too unreal. His father had spoken of the Skinwalker, of the ritual, of the dangers they faced, but now, this was something worse. "What do you mean? You're telling me the forest itself is alive?" The silence between them seemed to stretch for miles, the air around them thickening, almost impossibly so. The shadows shifted in the corners of Alex's vision, flickering like ghosts, too fast, too unnatural. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. His father nodded slowly. "Alive, in its own way. It's a place of death, of forgotten things. And when something like that, the Skinwalker, begins to feed, it wakes up. It makes things worse. It calls to other things. It calls to them all." The air around them seemed to ripple, vibrating with a sound too low to hear, but deep enough to feel in the very marrow of their bones. The woods seemed to grow darker, the trees towering over them like massive twisted sentinels. The path ahead was swallowed by the darkness, the deep shadows extending unnaturally, as though the forest was pulling away, retreating into a place beyond the edges of time. I can't," Alex stammered, feeling the panic rise in his throat. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep walking into this nightmare. We can't leave," his father interrupted, his voice tight, almost frantic now. "We can't go back to the house. Not now. Not with it out there. We have to stop it here. We have to finish what we started." Alex wanted to scream, to collapse under the weight of the fear that had become all-consuming. But something deep inside him, something primal, something buried beneath the layers of terror and confusion, knew his father was right. The Skinwalker, whatever it was, would come for them again. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. They walked on, the darkness closing in around them like the walls of a tomb, and every step they took felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed to shift, the trees leaning toward them, their twisted branches creaking and groaning under the weight of some unseen presence. Alex could feel the pressure in the air, as though the woods themselves were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake, to slip. The path became increasingly treacherous, the ground uneven, littered with rocks and thick roots that seemed to rise from the earth like fingers, trying to grasp at their legs. Every now and then, Alex would hear a rustling, a scraping of leaves, a breath too soft to be real, But when he turned, there was nothing there. He could feel eyes on him, but there was nothing he could do. The forest seemed alive with unseen things, things that moved just beyond his sight, their presence like a dark cloud hanging over them. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the clearing. It was the same clearing where the ritual had been performed, the place where the creature had appeared. But now, it was different. The air was thick with a palpable tension, the ground beneath them unnaturally cold, as though the earth itself had turned against them. "Here," his father said, his voice a whisper. "We have to finish this. We have to call the spirits. We have to bind it." Alex didn't speak. His body was frozen, his mind racing with questions that couldn't be answered. But the ritual, whatever it was, seemed to be the only way forward. It was their last chance. His father knelt at the center of the clearing, arranging the ritual objects with trembling hands. Herbs, crystals, bones, a knife, the same knife that had been used before. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing closer, swallowing the light from the stars above. Alex didn't understand it. He didn't know how this would work, but he knew one thing. They had to do it, or they would die. His father began to chant. The words were the same as before, ancient and foreign, slipping through the air like shadows. The sound was soothing, but not in the way a voice should be. It was hypnotic, like something older than man, older than the world itself, crawling into their minds and planting seeds of dread. Each syllable seemed to stretch the time, pulling them into a state of unease that made every muscle in Alex's body tremble with fear. And then suddenly the growl came again. But this time it was closer, much closer. Alex's heart skipped a beat, and before he could even comprehend what was happening, the ground beneath him trembled. The trees seemed to shudder, and the earth groaned, as though something was rising from the depths below. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of rot, of something ancient and hungry. The growl turned into a howl, one that ripped through the air with the force of a storm. It was here. Alex turned, his eyes wide with terror, and there, standing in the edge of the clearing, was the creature, the Skinwalker. But it was different this time. It was no longer just a figure in the dark. It was an embodiment of the forest itself, of the land's decay, of the darkness that had swallowed everything in its path. It had grown larger, its form more solid, more real. Its face, once a twisted mask, was now even more grotesque, its features elongated and nightmarish. Its eyes, those black, endless pits, were locked onto them. But there was no longer any question in Alex's mind. The creature was not just hunting them, it was feeding on them. "You shouldn't have come," the creature whispered, its voice slipping into Alex's mind like a knife through flesh. "You can't stop it. You can't stop me." The forest seemed to echo with the creature's words, the trees groaning in agony, as though they were bending to its will. The ground beneath Alex's feet shifted, like quicksand, pulling him deeper into the earth. He could feel the tendrils of darkness reaching for him, could feel the very air around him growing thick, suffocating, as though the world was collapsing inward. But his father didn't move, he didn't falter. His voice rose, louder now, chanting the words with a fervor that matched the growing madness in the air. "Spirits of the earth," his father cried out, "we call upon you. Bind this thing to the land. Bind it to the earth, to the darkness. We ask for your power." And then, with a force that shook the very ground beneath them, the ritual reached its climax. The creature screamed, a shriek of pure, unadulterated rage that split the air like thunder. It recoiled, its form distorting, its limbs twisting in impossible angles, as if the ritual had forced it to become something even worse than it already was. Its eyes locked onto Alex, its gaze filled with hatred, with hunger. But the ritual wasn't finished. Not yet. "Help me!" his father screamed, as the ground trembled beneath them, as the darkness roared, and the world exploded into chaos. Chapter 7. Into the depths of fear delves into the escalating terror Alex and his father face as they perform the final ritual to fight the Skinwalker. The tone is filled with dread, suspense, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness as they are pulled deeper into the darkness of the forest. The creature's power grows, and the intensity of their struggle escalates, setting the stage for an ultimate confrontation. Let me know if you need further elaboration or details added. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the air thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very earth itself was struggling to hold on to its last threads of stability. The trees around them groaned, their twisted limbs swaying as if reacting to the energy rippling through the forest. Every crackle, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified, growing louder, until the sounds became deafening, a cacophony of supernatural terror. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous reminder that they were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting against something ancient, something beyond comprehension, a force that had been lurking in the depths of this cursed land for centuries. The Skinwalker was no longer just a creature. They were facing a living nightmare, a malevolent force that had wrapped itself around the very fabric of the world they knew. The creature stood before them, its form more grotesque than ever, twisted and contorted in ways that defied logic. It no longer resembled anything human. It was a nightmare made flesh, a horrible amalgamation of beast and man, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the very essence of their souls. The darkness around it was alive, swirling, as though the forest itself was bending and warping to its will. Alex's throat was dry, his body trembling from the terror that gripped him. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, to flee, but his feet were rooted to the earth, as if the darkness had wrapped its claws around him, holding him in place. He turned to his father, but the man was no better off. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in his gaze, something resolute, something desperate. "We have to finish this," his father said, his voice hoarse but steady, cutting through the oppressive air like a blade. "It's the only way. We can't let it win." Alex nodded, but the words didn't fully sink in. How could they finish this? How could they defeat something so powerful, so ancient? The ritual had been their last hope. But now, standing face to face with the Skinwalker, it seemed impossible. The creature's gaze locked onto Alex, its black eyes gleaming with malice, its twisted mouth stretching into a horrific grin. It took a step forward, its long limbs moving with unnatural grace, the ground beneath its feet warping with every step. Alex could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him, as if the creature were feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each breath he took. "You can't escape," the Skinwalker hissed, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from all around them. It wasn't just speaking to them, it was speaking to the very world itself. "You belong here. You've always belonged here." The words cut through Alex like a blade, and he staggered back, his body trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. How could it know? How could it know that deep, unspoken fear that had been eating away at him since the moment he set foot in this forest? That fear of belonging, of being drawn to something dark, something that had always been a part of him, even if he hadn't known it. His father took a step forward, holding the knife with trembling hands, but his voice was strong, almost defiant. "You will not have him." The Skinwalker's grin widened, impossibly wide, stretching beyond what any human mouth should have been capable of. "You think you can stop me? You think the ritual will work?" The creature laughed, a deep guttural sound that rumbled through the earth like thunder. "The ritual was never meant to banish me. It was never meant to stop me. You've only given me more power, more strength. You've fed me." Alex's heart stopped. His father's eyes went wide in shock, his grip on the knife loosening. The truth slammed into them like a freight train. The ritual, the thing they had clung to as their last hope, had failed. They had fed the creature. They had empowered it. "We've made a mistake," his father whispered, his voice breaking. "We've made it stronger." The Skinwalker took another step forward, its eyes burning with hunger. Its form flickered, shifting, and Alex saw the truth. The thing before him was not one creature, not one entity. It was a shapeshifter, a being that existed in multiple forms, in multiple worlds. It was every creature that had ever been consumed, every soul that had been trapped in the forest, every terror that had haunted these woods for centuries. The darkness around them seemed to pulse with the Skinwalker's presence, growing thicker, more oppressive. It was everywhere now, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket, cutting off any hope of escape. Alex's lungs burned, and his head spun with the realization that there was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare they had unleashed. "Father, what do we do?" Alex gasped, his voice barely audible in the crushing silence. "What do we do now?" His father's eyes met his, and for a moment, Alex saw a flicker of something akin to regret, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His father stepped forward, his voice steady now, his determination renewed. "We fight," his father said simply, gripping the knife with newfound resolve. "We fight with everything we have." Alex wanted to argue. He wanted to scream that they were going to die, that they were already dead, but the words caught in his throat. The Skinwalker was no longer just a creature. It was the embodiment of the forest, of death itself, and they were trapped. The creature lunged, faster than Alex could react, its claws outstretched, its mouth wide with that grotesque smile. But his father was ready. With a primal yell, his father thrust the knife forward, aiming for the Skinwalker's heart. The blade sank into the creature's flesh with a sickening wet sound. But the Skinwalker didn't howl in pain. It didn't flinch. Instead, its grin grew wider, and Alex could feel it. The knife, the blade that had been meant to banish it, was being consumed by the darkness. The creature absorbed the energy, the power, the very essence of the strike, and with it, it grew even stronger. "No!" Alex shouted, but it was too late. The creature grabbed his father by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. His father's hands scrabbled at the creature's grip, but the strength in his father's arms was fading, his body weakening with each passing second. "You can't win," the Skinwalker rasped, its voice now more than just a whisper. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the earth itself. "You can't stop me. Not now. Not ever." Alex's chest tightened, his vision blurred with panic and terror. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't watch his father die. He couldn't let this thing, this monstrosity, consume them both. He looked down at the ritual circle, the herbs, the crystals, the remains of the ritual. It wasn't over. There had to be something left, some way to stop this thing, to sever its hold on the forest. His fingers twitched, desperate to reach for the knife, for anything that could help. His mind screamed with the knowledge that if he didn't act, they were both doomed. "Father," Alex screamed, his voice cracking. "Please, help me!" But his father's eyes were already half-lidded, his strength gone, his life slipping away with each breath. In a frantic, desperate motion, Alex grabbed the knife, his hands shaking as he turned toward the creature. He thrust the blade into the earth, plunging it deep into the center of the ritual circle, pushing it with all his strength, all his fear, into the heart of the forest. The ground beneath him rumbled, the air thickening with an energy that felt alive, electric. The creature howled, the sound a twisting mixture of rage and agony, as the darkness around them began to pulse, to recoil, as though the very forest was rejecting it. Alex pressed harder. The blade sank deeper, the earth shaking beneath his feet as if something was breaking. Something was tearing. The Skinwalker's scream reached a deafening pitch, and in that moment, Alex realized what had to be done. The forest had to be cleansed. The darkness had to be ripped out by the roots. He had to sever the link, the very essence that bound the creature to the land. With one final, desperate cry, Alex yanked the knife free and plunged it back into the earth, into the center of the ritual circle. The ground erupted. The force of the explosion sent Alex sprawling backward, but it wasn't a blast of fire or heat. It was the force of pure, untamed power, magic, ancient and raw, coursing through the earth, through the trees, through the very air. The creature's form shattered, its screams tearing through the night like the sound of 1,000 souls writhing in agony. And then silence. The darkness that had once consumed them receded, slowly, as if the forest itself was taking a deep, reluctant breath. The trees no longer seemed to loom over them like watchers, like predators. The air was still, but it was no longer thick with malevolence. It was quiet, calm. Alex lay on the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling, his mind barely able to process what had just happened. The ritual, the fight, the creature, it was all a blur. but it was done. For now. His father was beside him, his body crumpled on the forest floor, but alive, weak, gasping for air, but alive. Alex crawled to his side, his heart thundering with both relief and confusion. They had won, but at what cost? What had they truly unleashed? And would the peace last? The woods were silent, but the scars of their encounter would remain forever. Chapter 8. The final confrontation concludes the intense battle between Alex, his father, and the Skinwalker. The terror reaches its peak as the creature grows stronger, and the ritual becomes their last hope. The chapter ends with a powerful supernatural confrontation, but it leaves lingering questions about the true nature of the forest and the cost of their survival. Let me know if you need further elaboration or any adjustments. Chapter 9. The haunting echoes. The morning that followed felt wrong. The first rays of light struggled to break through the dense canopy of the forest, painting the sky a dull, muted grey. It was as if the sun had been swallowed whole, unable to pierce the shadow that still clung to the land. The woods, though silent, felt alive, pulsing with something ancient and dark, something that Alex couldn't fully understand but knew was there. It pressed against his chest, like a suffocating weight, a reminder that no matter how much time had passed since the ritual, the battle with the Skinwalker was far from over. Alex sat on a fallen log, his body trembling, despite the cold not being as intense as before. His eyes were fixed on the forest around him, but he couldn't see anything. Not really. The trees loomed like silent giants, their shadows stretching long and twisted across the ground, their gnarled limbs clawing at the air as if trying to escape from the soil they had been rooted in for centuries. It was a landscape both familiar and strange, a place that had once been home, but now seemed alien, dangerous, and filled with a malevolent presence. The smell of damp earth lingered in the air, the pungent odor of decay and rot. But there was something more now, a faint metallic scent that Alex couldn't quite place. It was as if the forest had been tainted, its very essence warped by something that had been stirred awake. The creature, the Skinwalker, had left its mark on this place, and Alex could feel it deep within his bones. His father, still weak, still recovering from the violent encounter with the Skinwalker, sat beside him. The older man's face was pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. But there was something more there, something that Alex couldn't quite identify, something haunting, something hollow. It was as if the battle had taken more than their physical strength. It had taken their souls. For hours, neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of the unspoken horror that had unfolded between them and the ancient, twisted creature that had almost consumed them both. The events that had transpired still felt like a nightmare, so vivid, so raw, yet so distant. But the truth remained clear. They had fought. They had survived. But at what cost? Finally, it was Alex who broke the silence, his voice rough, strained, and unfamiliar in the still air. "Do you think it's over?" His voice trembled despite his best efforts. The question was stupid, but it had to be asked. His father didn't look at him. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the ground, as if the earth itself held the answers. "No," he replied, his voice a low rasp. "It's never over." The words struck Alex like a slap to the face. He could feel the coldness in his father's tone, the heaviness in his words. It was a truth that resonated deep inside him. But it wasn't one he wanted to accept. "But we did the ritual. We killed it. His voice faltered, as though the words themselves couldn't hold the weight of what had happened. "You don't understand." His father's voice was flat, devoid of any hope. He finally turned to look at Alex, but there was no reassurance in his eyes, no comfort. Only the hollow remnants of someone who had seen too much. "The Skinwalker is only a part of it. The ritual was meant to bind it, but you can't just destroy something like that with a chant or a blade. It's part of the land, part of the curse. And curses, they never die." Alex's stomach clenched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to understand that everything they had fought for might have been in vain. But his father's face was grim. his eyes hard with the understanding that only someone who had lived through it could know. It was never just about the Skinwalker, his father continued. It was the land that cursed us, the very earth we walked on. This place, it's been feeding on fear, on suffering, for as long as the trees have stood. The Skinwalker, it's just a manifestation, a symptom of something deeper, something older. A chill crawled up Alex's spine, and for the first time he felt it, the sense of something watching, something older than the creature they had faced, something more powerful. He could feel it pressing in on him, on them both, like the tightening grip of invisible hands, slowly suffocating them, pulling them deeper into the madness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alex asked, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He wanted answers, wanted the truth, no matter how terrible it was. "Why didn't you say any of this before? All this time you let me think that we were safe, that this place was just haunted." His father's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know the full extent of it. I didn't know how deep the curse ran until it was too late." Alex's fists clenched at his sides. The bitterness, the anger, the fear, all welled up inside him like a storm ready to break. "You knew there was something wrong. You knew about the Skinwalker, and you didn't tell me." His father's face darkened. "I couldn't, Alex. I couldn't let you see it. I couldn't let you know the truth. I didn't want to pull you into this. I thought if I kept you away long enough, you wouldn't have to face it. But I was wrong." The air around them seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, the oppressive silence between them felt suffocating. Alex's mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and fear. But underneath it all, a single, simple thought began to take root. They were not safe. The creature might be gone, but the curse remained. The forest was still alive with malevolent energy, its roots tangled deep into the earth, feeding on the fear of those who dared to step into its domain. Alex could feel it, its power, its presence, all around them. And worse, he could feel it growing. A rustling noise broke through his thoughts, distant but unmistakable. It came from the shadows of the trees, the dark heart of the forest. Alex stood up, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned toward the sound, but all he could see was a blur of darkness. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves. But there was something else now. Something more sinister in the movement of the branches. "We're not alone," Alex said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. His father's head snapped toward him, his eyes wide with a fear that had never left them. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's back. It never truly left." The air grew heavier, thick with a palpable malevolence, like a fog closing in around them. Alex could feel the forest shift, its presence wrapping around them, pressing them into the earth. The shadows moved. No, they were moving. Something was out there, something that was no longer hiding, no longer just watching. And then, a whisper, too soft to hear with his ears, but too loud in his mind. It was a voice that was not his own. "You are mine." The words echoed through the trees, reverberating through Alex's mind like a curse, wrapping around his thoughts, twisting them, until he couldn't breathe. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices that came from the very depths of the forest, from the roots of the trees, from the very ground beneath his feet. "We need to go," his father said urgently, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can't stay here. We can't fight it anymore. The forest is—" But before his father could finish, the shadows shifted again, and something emerged from the trees. It wasn't the Skinwalker. Not exactly. It was something more. Something far worse. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, its very essence made flesh. Alex's heart stopped. The creature that emerged from the darkness was like nothing he had seen before. Its body was twisted, broken, like the very bones of the earth had been reshaped into something unholy. Its limbs were long, too long, covered in patches of skin that seemed to move, as if alive. The face was a mask, a shifting, contorting mask that flickered between forms, human, animal, grotesque. Its eyes gleamed with that same black, soulless depth, but they were not just watching. They were looking, looking into Alex, into the very heart of him, searching, feeding on his fear. "You will never leave," the voice said again. But this time it was not a whisper. It was a roar, a cry that shook the very trees. "You are mine. All of you." The creature reached toward them, its hands stretching impossibly long, its fingers like claws, reaching for their souls. The forest closed in, the shadows twisting, choking them, trapping them in the very heart of its nightmare. Alex and his father had only one choice left. They ran. Chapter 9. The Haunting Echoes dives deeper into the psychological horror and supernatural terror that Alex and his father face after the ritual. The tension and dread build as the forest and the curse seem to have a life of their own, and the lingering presence of the Skinwalker escalates. This chapter ends on a cliffhanger, with the realization that the fight is far from over. Let me know if you'd like further elaboration, or if you want to continue exploring the story. Chapter 10. The Unseen Path. The forest had become a prison. Every tree, every twisted branch seemed to stretch out toward them, its limbs curling like fingers, desperate to pull them deeper into the darkness. The night had fallen fully now, the moon swallowed whole by a blanket of thick clouds, leaving them in a suffocating, impenetrable darkness. The air was cold, biting, and damp with the scent of decay. The rustling of the leaves sounded like whispers, too soft to hear but loud enough to feel. It was as though the very earth beneath them was alive, writhing, pulling at their feet, as if trying to hold them in place. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the underbrush, his heart thudding in his chest. His legs were heavy, each step seeming more difficult than the last. His father walked beside him, but the man's presence felt distant now, as if the bond between them had been severed, as if the horrors they had witnessed had driven them further apart, leaving only the hollow remains of what they once were. "Dad." Alex's voice trembled, and he hated himself for it. He had always been the strong one, the one who could face the world without fear. But not here. Not in this place. What is happening? Why is it still after us? His father didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ground ahead of him, his face pale, his lips drawn tight in a grim line. Alex could see the fear in his father's eyes, deep, raw, and suffocating. But there was something else there, something that Alex hadn't seen before, a resignation, a knowledge that they weren't going to escape this place. The weight of it all pressed down on Alex. His breath came faster, his hands trembling at his sides. But no matter how fast they walked, no matter how much distance they put between them and the clearing where the Skinwalker had last appeared, the feeling never left. The feeling of being watched. The feeling of something behind them, moving just out of sight, following them through the trees like a shadow they couldn't outrun. "It's not over." His father's voice was barely more than a whisper, the words carried by the wind. He spoke as if the words themselves were poisoned, too terrible to utter aloud. But Alex heard them, and the weight of them nearly made his legs buckle beneath him. "It's never over, Alex," his father continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "We can't escape it. We can't fight it. Not here. Not anymore." Alex's mind raced, the reality of his father's words crashing down on him with the force of a falling tree. He had seen what the Skinwalker could do, had witnessed the ritual fail, had felt the power of the curse coil around him, suffocating him. But they had made it out once, hadn't they? They had fought it, survived it. But as he looked around at the forest, the trees, the darkness, the air thick with malevolent energy, he realized that something had changed. The forest itself had become part of the curse. "No." Alex shook his head, trying to force the words out of his mouth, though he knew deep down that it was already too late. "No, we can't give up. We can't just let it take us." His father's gaze flicked to him then, but it wasn't the look of a man trying to comfort his son. It was the look of someone who had lived through a nightmare so long that they no longer had the strength to fight it. "It's already taken us, Alex," his father whispered. "We're already part of it." The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, suffocating any hope that might have remained. The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver through Alex's body. And for a moment he thought he saw something moving between the shadows. A figure, too tall, too thin, its form flickering, like a mirage in the darkness. He blinked, but when he opened his eyes again, it was gone. "Do you see that?" Alex asked, his voice rising in panic. His father didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man already resigned to his fate. Alex followed, but his heart pounded harder with every step. The deeper they went, the thicker the shadows became, the heavier the air. It felt like the very land was closing in on them, suffocating them, as if the forest was alive, its dark heart pulsing with a rhythm they couldn't escape. The trees seemed to lean in closer with every passing moment, their twisted trunks bending at impossible angles, their roots sprawling out like veins, stretching deep into the earth. The very ground beneath them seemed to shift, as though it was alive, a living, breathing thing that had opened its jaws and was slowly swallowing them whole. And then the whispers came. They were soft at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind, but then they grew louder, more insistent, until Alex could hear them in his own head, their voices scraping against his mind like claws on glass. The words were indecipherable at first, a jumble of syllables and half-formed sentences, but then they coalesced into something clear. "You can't escape. You belong here. You are part of us." Alex clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside him now, curling around his thoughts like a vine, squeezing, tightening with every breath he took. His chest felt tight, his stomach twisted with the sickening realization that the curse was not just a creature, not just a monster. It was the land itself. The very earth beneath them was part of it, feeding it, nourishing it. The forest was alive, but it was not alive in the way anything should be. It was tainted. "Dad!" Alex gasped, stumbling forward. His breath was coming too fast now, his head spinning, his body convulsing with the weight of the voices that were inside him, the whispers that were clawing at his mind, ripping apart his thoughts. His father was ahead of him now, walking steadily forward, his back hunched, his head low, as though he too had heard the voices, as though he had already given in to them. There was no fight left in him. There was only the slow, inevitable march into the darkness. "Dad, stop!" Alex shouted, reaching out for his father's arm, but his fingers passed right through him. He froze, his blood running cold. His father was standing in front of him, but he wasn't there. He was a shadow, a flickering image that swayed unnaturally in the dim light, his edges blurred, his form distorted. He didn't respond to Alex's touch, didn't even look at him. And then the ground shook. Not a tremor, not a shift in the earth. The ground trembled. It was as if the very roots of the forest had come to life, as if the earth itself was rising, pulling them down into the depths. The sky above darkened, the clouds swirling into a vortex that seemed to pull the very stars into its maw. The wind howled, a voice of pure fury that echoed through the forest, tearing at their clothes, biting at their skin. The trees groaned, their limbs creaking under an unbearable weight. And then, the darkness shifted. It moved. The shadows bent, twisted, contorted. And from the center of the dark, something emerged. It was not the Skinwalker. No, this was something far worse. Something that made the Skinwalker look like a fleeting nightmare. It was the land itself taking shape. The trees, the shadows, the earth, all of it merged into a form. A massive, shifting mass of darkness and living wood, roots twisting and snaking out like tendrils, branches writhing like snakes, and in the center, a single eye, black, endless, a void of pure malevolence. "You are mine," the voice echoed through the forest, not a whisper, but a roar. "You are part of me. You will never leave." Alex's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His body shook, paralyzed by the sight of the creature, the very embodiment of the curse. It was not just a thing. It was the forest. It was the darkness that had consumed everything, the ancient force that had laid in wait for centuries, feeding off the terror of those who dared to enter its domain. But before Alex could react, his father, his shadowed father, stepped forward. And with a voice that Alex barely recognized as his own, his father spoke. "We end this now." Chapter 10. The unseen path builds toward the final confrontation, with Alex and his father trapped in the heart of the curse. The forest itself becomes an enemy, alive and malevolent, feeding on their fear. The tone grows darker as the realization sets in. The battle they fought was only the beginning, and they are not just facing a creature, they are fighting the land itself. This chapter sets the stage for the ultimate choice, the final moment of reckoning. Let me know if you would like to expand on any particular part or explore the storyline further.